Hello and welcome to this seminar that has the topic When Secularization Pressures Christians, Lessons from Sweden. And as you will probably have heard already, my name is Olof Edsinger and my main occupation is that I'm the General Secretary of the Swedish Evangelical Alliance. We work, you could say, as a voice in the public sphere, being quite active in public debate, both in church matters and in secular magazines. We produce materials on strategic topics of different kinds. And we also try to unite Christians from different parts of the evangelical church here in Sweden. I myself live in Uppsala, or actually in Storvreta, north of Uppsala. And I'm a writer also and an author of quite a few books. Previously I worked with youth and also with children on a national level in SALT, which is the youth and children's organization of the Swedish Evangelical Mission. So that also explains, I think, some of the topics that we will cover in this seminar. I have been very much involved with youth culture and the younger generation. But let's just pray and get into this. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to meet once again and to have this seminar. I pray that you guide me and guide us all in how we can be made aware of the situation, but also equipped for the situation right now in the Nordic countries and in Sweden and Finland in particular. We invite you, Holy Spirit, to be present and be our supreme teacher in everything that we will partake in. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think secularization in itself is a very interesting topic. In the 1960s, the sociologist Peter Berger formulated his so-called Secularization Hypothesis. And this stated that secularization was an inevitable byproduct of the modernization of the Western society and probably of the world as a whole. A few decades later, however, Peter Berger publicly retracted this hypothesis because the development had actually been the opposite of what he had predicted. In recent years, religion has played an even greater role around the world, both due to Islamism, Hindu and Buddhist nationalist movements, and of course also due to Christian revivals. At the same time, we as Nordic citizens, we live in a part of the world where secularization really has continued, at least with the exception of immigration. According to the so-called World Values Survey, Protestant Europe stands out more than any other countries in terms both of individualism and secularization. Scandinavia is the part that stands out the most, with Finland close nearby. At the same time, different countries have partly different histories when it comes to this. The overall trends are largely the same, at least in the Western world, but different phenomena reinforce these trends in different places. Swedish secularization, for example, it has a strong connection to the political development of the 20th century. Not least with the Social Democratic Party ruling almost without interruptions for a period of 50 years. During this time, Sweden was characterized by the materialist view that prevailed in socialist circles, but also by the politicization of the Lutheran Church of Sweden, which was launched during these decades. So in this way, the Church of Sweden has become one of the world's most politicized churches, you could say. And this development, it has continued also after the official separation of church and state in Sweden. Just to pick one example, the Church of Sweden is probably the only church in the world whose General Assembly does not grant the bishops the right to vote even in doctrinal matters. As far as I know, that is unique to the Swedish Lutheran Church, after it broke with the state church system. Unfortunately, this also has consequences for the development of society in general. It's sometimes said that secularization begins within the church, and while this is not the whole truth, it is still a very relevant observation. In Sweden, we can very clearly see, not least in LGBTQ issues, that the Church of Sweden has actually been at the forefront of the development. So it's not just a matter of the church having adapted to society in general. The church is actually helping society to change in this area. The farther the secularization and politicization of the church has come, the more it has become a driving force also behind the LGBTQ agenda. A truly sad and strange situation. And as a matter of fact, the church has in many ways come to regard itself as a prophetic spearhead with the task of leading the way and challenging the old ways of thinking, not least when it comes to this area. Now, as a parenthesis, one could also add that the same type of development takes place within the Swedish Free Church movement. We have considerably larger free churches in Sweden than in Finland, so they play a major role in Swedish Christianity. But secularization is part also of that story. Not in the sense that the free churches are as politicized as the Church of Sweden is, but in the sense that one is more and more affected by the surrounding culture. The energy and willingness to stand up for politically incorrect attitudes is rapidly declining, also in charismatic Christian circles. And as Bible reading and Bible teaching diminish, so does resilience to the pressure of secularization. Much of today's Christian preaching is a fairly general kind of humanism, characterized not least by that which I will talk about tonight. On the one hand, postmodernism, and on the other, narcissism. Preaching on topics like sin and guilt and holiness is receding, and what remains is a more general talk about love and grace and affirmation. So, how have we tried to counter this development from the part of the Swedish revival movement? Well, I will speak some more about that, but on a more general level, one can mention such movement as Oasis and New Wine, both of which are renewal movements with a focus on being life-giving injections into established Christianity. The Oasis movement in particular has been of great importance to a lot of individuals in the Church of Sweden, but it has not really been able to influence the development that we see now in the church as a whole. So to a large extent it has been what is also its name, that is an oasis in the desert. Of course, very important as such, but without the ability to really impact the whole church, unfortunately. As for me, I have been involved in quite a few different contexts that have tried to take a fight when it comes to the development in the area of LGBTQ. So I will actually devote much of this seminar to this particular aspect of secularization. This issue too has many dimensions. A possible approach could have been to go through how the Church of Sweden in the last decades has approached the theology around homosexuality, for instance. But instead I want to take this from a more personal perspective, telling a bit more about how I and others in my network have acted to offer some kind of counter-offensive, both about how society and the church has chosen to push these issues. I also want to focus a bit more on the last two letters of the LGBTQ alphabet, that is the T and the Q. And this is because more and more it has turned out that the emphasis, the last years at least, has shifted to be not so much about homosexuality actually, but rather about phenomena like trans and queer. So we will look a bit more into that. The way that I myself started to encounter these phenomena was when I read a report about the latest school materials for the Swedish sexual education. There were several things in these materials that struck me. Some examples was that they consistently presented sex as primarily individualistic. So actually they never even mentioned stable and loving relationships as the natural or desired context of sex. None of the four materials actually mention that you can have sex within a marriage. That was an information that was absent from all these school materials. It was a purely individualistic description of sexuality. There was no information whatsoever about how to build a strong and lasting relationship. That of course is some kind of logic, since you don't speak about marriage and don't want to be normative around these things, then you don't give instructions about how you can build strong relationships either. One material actually gave instructions about how you can do if you wanted to leave a relationship, to quit a relationship, but none of them said anything about how to enter a good and lasting relationship. Another interesting thing was that 3 out of 4 materials chose not to talk at all about the biological side of sex, such as the possibility of getting pregnant and issues surrounding this experience. So all in all, sex was removed from the context both of marriage, of stable relationships, and of pregnancy. That is Swedish sexual education these days. What was instead pushed very strongly in these materials was what in Sweden is called norm-critical pedagogy. In one of the materials, this was expressed this way: that despite information and legislation, the heteronorm is still fortified in society. One is presumed to be heterosexual until one openly show or tell that one has a different sexual orientation. Parents may presuppose that their children grow up to form heterosexual core families. Just one example from one material. Another material shared its concerns this way: there is still a strongly dominating mindset in society concerning how one should be and how one should live. It is often presumed that you should love someone of the other sex and want to form a family consisting of mother, father, and child. This is often called the heteronorm. Yet another material has the same point, but this one with reference to the animal world. Sometimes it is said that there is a kind of sexuality that is more biologically natural than another. But through studies of higher standing animals, and particularly our closest relatives among the anthropoid apes, one has found that they are acting out their sexuality towards their own as well as the opposite sex. And on the next page in the same material, they posed the question: is it at all desirable to be normal? These statements made me a bit curious because I can't remember that much from the time when I was in school and had sexual education, but these are quite new wordings compared to what I remember from my own time in school. And there are some common threads here, one being the critique of the heteronorm, and another the overall critique of wanting to be normal, or even the concept of normality as something that exists altogether. And it was when I started to scratch a bit on the surface of these words that I also came across what is called the queer theory. Just to make a brief historical overview, one could say that the women's movement that was formed in the end of the 19th century, they fought for equal rights for men and women, for instance concerning the right to vote in public elections. But they did so from the starting point that men and women are different but equal. Different but equal. That was what the first women's movement had on its agenda. Our biology and our gender roles differ, but we should still be treated in a similar way and with the same human rights. The so-called second wave of feminism that evolved in the 1960s, this introduced the concept of gender roles as primarily a social construct. The biological sex, they said, is a fact, but the social consequences of our biological sex are not as fixed or rigid as has often been said. And while this is or was quite a radical movement in its time, most Christians, at least in Sweden, would agree on the basic idea. The biological sex is fixed, but the gender roles are more fluid and more affected by the culture. I certainly agree, to some extent at least, with that assumption. But the revolutionary aspect of that which is called queer theory, which is also called the third wave of feminism, is that here it's not only our gender roles but also our biological sex that is perceived as a social construct. So you actually say not just your roles are culturally affected, but your biological sex is something that is constructed, which of course may sound very strange to some of us, but this is one of the essential teachings of the third wave feminism. And this also makes it easier to declare war on all ways of connecting the word normal to our talk about sexuality. From the perspective of queer theory, there is no such thing as normal sexuality. Rather, our sexuality is perceived as fluid, and you can therefore oppose all the traditional norms in this area, such as the heteronorm, that is that the majority of the population is heterosexual and should be expected to be just that, or the binary norm, telling us that humanity for the most part is consisting of women and men, and that this is just as it should be. It's a binary thing with male and female in creation. Now, to anyone with a more traditional view on this subject, queer theory may sound quite extreme, but the fact of the matter is that this way of thinking has already made a strong impact in the Swedish and indeed big parts of the international LGBTQ movement. About a decade ago, there was a big discussion within this movement about which strategy one should use to advance LGBTQ rights in society as a whole. And so on one side was people inspired by queer ideology, and on the other side the more traditional gay movement. That is, people who had been fighting for gay rights, such as the right to marry and the right to adopt children, but who still believe that there is a binary creation. Male and female are really existing categories. But the queer ideologies, they accused the gay rights people for having a too narrow agenda, and even for confirming the hetero norm that was so detested by these people. Since they were, you could say, fighting for the same privileges, the gay movement was fighting for the same privileges as the heterosexual part of the population. the queer ideologists, they wanted to go much farther than this. They claim that all fixed labels when it comes to sexuality are counterproductive, because their vision of true freedom for sexual minorities was that no one should even be able to call himself or herself normal. And also that the way to fight hostility and discrimination towards sexual minorities must in fact be to say that everything is equally normal. There is no natural starting point. All sexual orientations, all genders, also genders apart from the gender male and female, are on equal footing. It's with this kind of attitude and this ideology around gender that we can take away all remaining grounds for discriminatory behavior. And as you might know or otherwise have guessed, it was the queer view that won favor in big parts of the LGBTQ movement, at least here in the West, and certainly in Sweden. I will in a while also say something more about the T in LGBTQ, the trans movement. But already now I think it's quite obvious why this queer theory has become such an important part of the new landscape when it comes to sexuality. Also, to be transgender means that you have a gender identity that does not correspond to your biological sex, at least not as it was assigned as at birth. Or maybe trans could also mean that you live in such a way that you don't conform to societal gender norms or roles. But all this sort of goes together with the overarching queer ideology that tells us that sexuality is fluid and that there are no normal starting points when it comes to sexuality or sexual identity. There is no heteronorm telling you that most actually are heterosexual. There is also no two-sex norm saying that the two sexes, the two genders, male and female, are the starting point, but queer works with a very much more fluid landscape. This also means, and I think this may be important to point out, that queer or trans specifically don't really relate to sexual promiscuity. We may connect the LGBTQ movement sometimes with promiscuity. And of course that is something that is quite prevalent on pride festivals and so forth. But the queer and trans ideologies are not very much connected to this. Rather, you can say they are a kind of radical individualism connected to sexual identity issues. Everyone should be free to define his or her sex and sexual orientation. And this should then be done without any reference to one's biological prerequisites. So the queer ideology and also the transgender population, they embody a new kind of ideal. You could actually call it a new kind of salvation message, telling you that you can be whoever you want, you don't need to conform, you can rise above creation itself, define yourself as you want. In other words, you are the master of creation. A radical individualistic approach. You can be whoever you want, no matter what your biology tells you that you should be. And therefore I think that the transgender people have the last years become very much the heroes of our culture. We have people like Conchita Wurst, the drag queen that won the Eurovision Song Contest in Copenhagen in 2014. We have Caitlyn Jenner, the former Olympic gold medal athlete, who changed his name from Bruce Jenner to Caitlyn in 2015. These have become modern icons, and they embody this ideal of the individual who goes against the flow, being totally true to himself, and in that way also standing above creation itself. But you can still ask the question how these quite extreme ideologies have become mainstream in such a short period of time. And as I said, I will soon say a bit more about transgenderism, but both when it comes to queer and trans, I think that a key to understand what's going on here is the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality. This word is defined by Wikipedia as an analytic tool which attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalized in society. Intersectionality considers that the various aspects of humanity, such as class, race, sexual orientation, disability, and gender, do not exist separately from each other, but are complexly interwoven. So the point here is that marginalization comes in many shapes and forms, and that many of these cooperate to create hierarchies, and they may be, of course, for good or for bad. So in this way of thinking, if you are a male, you are privileged compared to women. If you are white, you are privileged compared to people with colored skin. If you are heterosexual, you are privileged compared to homosexuals, and so forth. The list can be quite long. But this, to sum it up, means that a white heterosexual middle-aged man is on the top of the power ladder, while a black homosexual woman, for instance, would be at the bottom of the same ladder. But then the tables are turned, because when you combine this with more of a Marxist or postmodern ideology that tells you that the issue of power is actually more important than the issue of truth, what is true or natural or common, we simply can turn these power structures upside down. So from a strict power analysis, the white heterosexual middle-aged man is perceived as an oppressor, while the black homosexual woman is perceived as a representative of those who are oppressed. So therefore it doesn't really matter if the white heterosexual man is making a good point in what he is saying, or the views that he holds in that context. If the black homosexual woman disagrees with what the white heterosexual man is saying, she is the one that will be listened to. Not necessarily because she has better arguments, because this is really not an issue about true or false, but rather about power. And her being a voice from the margins, or at least perceived as being a voice from the margins, means that she is the one that will be listened to. And here comes the application of this to the subject of trans and queer, because the postmodern culture, I would say, is almost obsessed with minorities, especially with minorities who are perceived as oppressed. And who can be more marginalized than a sexual minority such as the transgendered? Therefore, you could say that the representatives of this movement will have a disproportionately strong impact on society as a whole. They are the new elite because they are such a small minority. In a postmodern sense, they are crowned with this new kind of glory, being a minority that everyone wants to listen to. And something nice in that, but it's also something quite dangerous, because power is ruling over truth. So no matter who has the best case or the best arguments, the one who will be listened to is the one who can win in this power play, power struggle. And all this also fits very well into the larger narrative of radical individualism, the person himself being able to define himself or herself. Man as the master of creation, of course. Here we have man being the master or the lord over his or her own body. And as I already said, we have the minority as an underprivileged people group that everyone in a postmodern world really should be listening to. I think this explains how these very radical ideologies have become so influential in the last years, speaking specifically about trans and queer thinking. But I also think that this highlights another important thing to see when we look at the overall development around LGBTQ issues. And one thing is that the so-called gay issue is never enough. Actually, you can look at this alphabet and start from the start. Lesbian, gay, and bisexuality. Those were the first issues that were dealt with and also that were pushed into new legislation projects. But when those victories were won, you simply continue on the same spectrum, looking into the trans and the queer issues. So there is no logical stopping point, really. The development has to continue and go on and on. And to me, this is actually an important part of the explanation as to why Paul takes the issue of homosexuality and same-sex relationships as his prime example in Romans 1. Looking at his overall argument, he could probably say almost the same thing as he does without even mentioning same-sex relationships. But he chose to use this example, first of all, because it suited his thought of man turning his back to God, also turning his back on the creation order. But I think there is another secret here, and that is that when we are secularized and when we as a whole culture and nation turn our back on our Creator, this will always hit on the creation orders, and that means it will hit on sexuality issues. And what we see now also in our own countries is that when we normalize same-sex relationships in the way that we say that there is no essential difference between them and opposite-sex relationships, then we also say that our physical bodies have no say in the matter. There is no natural or normative aspect of man being created into different bodies, male bodies and female bodies, man and woman being united in a marriage covenant. When that is taken away, then our bodies are relativized, and this will also open not just for homosexual sex, but for all different aspects of the LGBTQ movement. And quite logically, at least here in Sweden, we now see even Christian leaders who promote things like polygamy and BDSM, that is bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism. Because when you have taken away the thought of heterosexual mutual sexual union as the norm, then it's very hard to put any other logical distinctions of where you should stop the development. So this is what we see now basically all over the Western world, but that we see very, very clearly in Sweden. And I think that this queer ideology that I started off with has been very key to this development. And my personal worries related to queer ideology, apart from this broader issue of how it opens up to more and more extreme forms of sexuality and sexual ideologies, is first of all that I think it's very likely to contribute to the increasing psychological ill health. Why? Well, I don't think that people thrive in an environment where everything is fluid. We see that already in the creation account, that human beings are created for structure and for creation orders. When we throw these out the window, it will affect us, and especially the young generation will be hit by that. We see now an increasing psychological ill health, not least among the young, and I think that is at least in part connected with this development. I also, to be honest, think that queer ideology is an encroachment on the young generation, because it takes away from them the pride in their biological sex. The biological sex is perceived as almost a problem to overcome rather than an asset in your building your own identity. But when we teach the young people that they should not trust the witness of their body, they should invent or define their own sexual identity apart from their biological sex. Well, to a small minority that may be a welcome message, but to most people it's just an intrusion in their personal lives that they have no need for, and that will cause much confusion among not least many young people. So you could say that with queer ideology, a struggle that used to be reserved for the few, those who end up identifying themselves as especially gay or bisexual, now this struggle is transferred to many. Basically all people are encouraged to sort of question their biological sex in a way that they really would not have needed to do. And finally, this also opens up to a sexual experimentation that will cause, I think, a lot of problems, because when people are actively encouraged to have, for instance, both boyfriends and girlfriends, no matter if they are homosexual or bisexual or not, well, in the long run, I think this will create quite a lot of baggage to carry with experiences with different sexual unions that you really were not helped by having. So once again, as I have worked a lot with youth, this has become an issue where I have taken a stand also publicly, because I think that many young people are negatively affected by queer ideology today. So what more specifically have we done to challenge these trends? Well, if we stick to projects that I have been involved in myself or people around me, the Swedish Evangelical Alliance has devoted quite a lot of energy in producing materials that can meet arguments both in the secular and the internal church debate. We have, for instance, a web page called äktenskap.info, that it's in Swedish marriage.org or .info, where we have lots of articles around these different topics with marriage, sexuality, LGBTQ. I was also personally one of the two editors of an anthology called True Colors, Bekänna färg in Swedish, which is an anthology about the church and the LGBTQ issues, both looking into theology and more pastoral issues. Then we have produced teaching material for Christian youth groups, where we try to give more of a holistic view of sex and relationships, but where we also address the issues of the Bible and LGBTQ, as there were no such materials on the market before. I myself wrote a shorter material for youth leaders called Sex in Queer Times, which more specifically point to how youth leaders can talk about identity and sexuality when they have people in front of them that are influenced by queer ideology. So these were some examples where we have worked closely with the Swedish Evangelical Alliance around this. But then parallel to that, we were also a group starting an organization focusing on our public schools here in Sweden, including producing a material for sex education in our schools. It's not a complete sex education material, but rather a complementary material, emphasizing the relationship side of sexual education. That is the part that we feel is missing very much in the Swedish schools. As I said, the school materials around sexual educations don't want to take a stand or even connect sex with stable relationships, and definitely not with marriage. So we simply wanted to create something that could be used, helping people to relate to the issue of building strong relationships and put sexuality into a greater context, which is actually what the curriculum says we should do, but unfortunately something that many schools don't do. So this was an attempt, at least from our side, to create materials that could be used also in public schools. I myself have also taken part in quite a lot of public debate, and not least in connection with the issues of gender dysphoria. That gives us a reason now to say something also about transgenderism and gender dysphoria. So let's do that while we're at it. I have already mentioned that queer theory is a view of sexuality as something fluid. You can basically go back and forth on a scale of heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, transsexuality, and then you can move back and forth on this scale. To be true to queer ideology, that would at least be how you view these things. But transgender is more of a metaphysical definition of sex. There are similarities between queer and trans, but they are not completely similar. So if you are a transgender, you generally identify yourself with the other biological sex. So you may actually be heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual or something else. But in your mind, you perceive yourself as something else than the sex that you were assigned at birth. So you may have a female body but believe to be a male, or a male body and believe yourself to be a woman. So interestingly, here you challenge queer ideology because you actually say there are two distinct sexes. So here we also see part of the confusion in the whole LGBTQ movement. Some of these ideologies are actually not really compatible, but they still go together under the same umbrella. Queer ideology questioning the binary order of the sexes, male, female, transgenderism being dependent on that order, because there is no use changing your sex if there is no binary order in creation. But once again, through this, the transgender movement has another definition of gender, because since you feel to be the opposite gender of your body, you also need to say that you have the opposite sex of your reproductive organs, your chromosomes, and your hormones, because all these together make up your gender identity. It's not just your body, your outside, it's also things like chromosomes, and you have chromosomes in every cell of your body. So actually you can't change sex, you can't change your gender in that sense because your cells are impossible to replace, but you can cut away things or make operations in your body that make you look like you have the other sex than your chromosomes and your hormones really tell that you have. Now this thing called transsexualism originally is known from a long time. It has been around probably as long as there has been humans, but it has affected a very, very small part of the population. And there are different statistics around this, between 1 in 5,000 and up to 1 in only 1 in 30,000 that could be labeled transsexuals, or as we say nowadays, could be given the diagnosis gender dysphoria. And according to the latest issue of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you need to have at least 2 of the following criteria to be given this diagnosis, gender dysphoria. So the first and most important is that you have a marked incongruence between your experienced or expressed gender and primary or secondary sex characteristics. So there's an incongruence here. You don't feel at home in your physical body. Other criteria are a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics, a strong desire for a primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender, a strong desire to be of the other gender, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender, a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. You hear these are similar, and these are criteria that you can use when you meet someone who feels he or she has gender dysphoria. And you don't need to tick in all these, but at least a couple of these need to be really relevant to get that diagnosis. Now, my view is that the church should treat the kinds of people that get this diagnosis with respect, because I do think that there are a very, very small portion of the population that generally has gender dysphoria. This could be the topic of a completely separate seminar. Maybe we could get back to these issues in the time of the Q&A, because it leads us a bit too far away from the main topic of today. But feel free to ask later on if you want to. I have studied this quite a lot, as you may understand. But what I want to mention, because this makes this whole issue so problematic today, is that when we talk about transgender today, we generally don't talk only about people with this specific diagnosis, but rather, as I have already said, we are dealing with an ideology that tries to generalize the experience of this very, very small part of the population and apply their experience to much larger parts or even all of the population. Just as I said about queer ideology, it is applied to all talk of sex and gender today. And it has quite similar results because it strengthens this picture today of sexuality as something basically fluid, and your sexual identity as something only in your mind, which also makes it easier for you to rule over this, to say that I myself can define my own sexuality, my own identity, my own gender. And transgenderism has become a big issue during the last few years, particularly within our schools, and I think the same goes for Finland here. But compared to other sexual minorities, such as people with homosexual orientation, transgenderism creates quite a few new challenges. For instance, there has been a strong focus on transgendered people's access to bathrooms and change rooms. And this affects everyone else in a way that someone being homosexual does not affect everyone else. Other issues has been the pronouns used to address a trans person. Should a teacher call this cute little girl by a boy's name, since she says that that is how she wants to be called? Or should the teacher refuse to do so with reference to her biological sex? Well, that it would be one specific issue to work with in a school setting, for instance. What has actually become a real game changer here in Sweden, though, is the rapid growth of teenagers wanting to make these kinds of transitions. Classical transsexualism is something that usually shows up quite early in a person's life, often already at the age of 3 or 4 years old. In recent years, however, we have seen a growing group of teenagers who come out as trans, often totally without a previous medical history. And this is interesting because classic transsexualism often is traceable back to early ages, but these people, they just out of the blue almost declare themselves transgender. Even more worrying, I would say, is that this group has a strong over-representation of girls, whereas the classic form of transsexualism is usually overrepresented among biological men. So there's a switch going on there. In many cases, it has also turned out that they have one or several other psychological diagnoses, with a particularly strong overrepresentation of people with autism. So there is something else going on here with other diagnoses playing into the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Some research that has been done on this phenomenon has also found traces of peer contagion. That is, the fact that in many cases, people who come out as trans turn out to have several friends who have done the same. And if you remember the previous figures, that this could be one in, well, if you count really high, 1 in 5,000, or maybe as low as 1 in 30,000 traditionally. The likelihood for several people in the same school class, for instance, being transgender are really, really small. But now you can have clusters of 3, 4, 5 people in the same class at school defining themselves as trans. So this is once again something completely different to traditional transsexualism. And some researchers talk about peer contagion, that you simply are affected by other peers, other people of the same age with this kind of situation. And taken all together, of course, this to me would give reason for all red lights to start flashing. Something is going on here that is really troublesome. And this is a big discussion, and it has also affected the debate in Sweden, where big parts of the population in Sweden has started to be more skeptical towards this phenomenon just the last years. Unfortunately, and this is where I should soon draw to close, This does not mean that the Church of Sweden has shown any signs of changing its mind on the issue. On the contrary, Sweden is still this prophetic spearhead, as it views itself, pushing these issues very hard. Just a couple of years ago, I personally had a debate with the Diocese of Västerås in Kyrkans Tidning, the major church magazine here in Sweden. That is church as in the Swedish Lutheran Church. They launched in the Diocese of Västerås what they called a survival guide for queer kids that totally uncritically confirmed children and youth in their gender confusion. And even though I challenged this in Kyrkans Tidning, no one from the Church of Sweden even stood up to my defense. Everyone just applauded what was going on in the Diocese of Västerås. And to me, of course, this is something sad because it really is a betrayal to the young generation who is so confused in its own gender identity, and where the church is also just encouraging that instead of asking critical questions. I think that is really a betrayal of the youth, an encroachment even to the youth. And to me, all this, and not least the speed of this development, illustrate that what I have been talking about in this seminar must also be considered a spiritual issue. Secularization is a spiritual issue, but also the way we see this development around LGBTQ issues, the speed of it and the content of it tells me that this is a spiritual problem with spiritual forces at work both in church and society. And therefore we really need to ask God for His wisdom in how we should encounter this. What I myself have found most fruitful, not least when I do public debate or write books about this, is to refer to simply what established science has to say on these matters. Because science generally weighs much heavier than Bible verses in a secular society. And these issues are part of the creation order and therefore are quite easy to relate to research. And I think that as Christians we never need to fear true research, because the truth is always our friend. Paul puts it this way in 2 Corinthians 13. We cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. Well, this is also my stand, and this is what I keep reminding myself of when things get tough around this. And that's what I wanted to share with you right now. I hope now that we can discuss different aspects of this seminar, both where I started off with secularization in general and the situation of Swedish Christianity, and not least, of course, the large Swedish Lutheran Church. But also we see this test case, you could call it, of the LGBTQ issues, which has been such an important part, I would say, also of secularization in the Swedish Church, both the Lutheran Church and the free churches, as this is an area where we tend to move away from scriptures and be very strongly affected by what's going on in society as a whole. And once again, as I said, when I look at this development, when I see the speed of this development, it makes me also read Romans 1 with slightly new glasses. I see things in that text that I didn't see previously, that when we leave the idea of the heteronorm, the idea that there is indeed a created order that we should not leave behind us. Well, when we actually do leave that behind us, then it opens the door for so much more than just one or two specific issues. We open the door to queer ideology and trans ideology, but in the long run, of course, even more confusion, both around sexuality and around our relationship with Holy Scriptures. So that's what I wanted to share with you here and now. Thank you.